Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, October 4th, 2022. Supreme Court hears oral arguments in a case that challenges Alabama's new congressional district lines, saying they violated the Voting Rights Act and disenfranchised black voters. Coming up, we'll hear the justices question the lawyers, including the newest justice, Katanji Brown Jackson, and get some analysis from Washington Post Supreme Court reporter Robert Barnes. Vice President Kamala Harris discussing economic equity at the Freedmen's Bank Forum held at the Treasury Department. The latest on Hurricane Ian recovery in Florida as President Biden gets set to go there along with the First Lady. President Biden today marking 100 days since the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade abortion decision and what he says is harmful restrictive abortion laws passed by states controlled by Republicans. Another U.S. military aid package for Ukraine as Ukraine continues its rather successful counteroffensive against Russia's invasion. This one from the U.S., $600 million, with more of the HIMARS, High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems. And as the Biden administration condemns North Korea's firing a ballistic missile over Japan, we'll hear from the U.S. State Department. Now to the Supreme Court case, Merrell v. Milligan, about Alabama's congressional district lines and the Voting Rights Act. Joining us on the phone is Washington Post Supreme Court reporter Robert Barnes. Thank you again for being with us. What is the issue in this case?
Well, in this case, Alabama redid its congressional lines after the census, as it is required to do. It has 7 congressional districts, and traditionally it has drawn the line so that one of those is a district that in which African American voters have a chance to, what the law says, elect a candidate of their choice. But about more than 27% of Alabama's voters are black, and that map was challenged, saying that there are enough black voters who live near each other and share common interests that there should be 2 congressional districts in which a black candidate would have a good chance to win. A 3-judge panel agreed with the challengers that that was correct under the existing law. And the Supreme Court decided to take up the case in order to look at the Voting Rights Act and what is required.
What kind of questions did you hear from the justices, and did it give you an indication which way they were going?
Well, I guess I sort of came away thinking that maybe the justices were looking for something narrower than what Alabama was asking for. Alabama basically said that for the challengers to win, they would have to come up with kind of a race-neutral way of showing that these districts should be drawn, and there was a lot of pushback. The liberal justices, the 3 liberals on the court, really unified and went after Alabama's argument, saying that that requirement was nowhere in the law, that Congress intended to make up for past discrimination by approving and encouraging the creation of these so-called majority-minority districts. And new Justice Katanji Brown Jackson sort of lectured Alabama's Solicitor General about the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, saying that it wasn't colorblind on race. It was, in fact, designed to help black voters.
You mentioned the new Justice, Katanji Brown Jackson. This is her second day of oral arguments. How has that been going?
Gosh, she's a very active questioner, jumps in right away, asks a lot of questions. Sometimes you think that the others might want her to slow down a little, but she is the only the first African-American woman on the court, only the second African-American serving right now. And so it was clear that this was an issue that was very important to her. She asked a lot of questions.
We're talking with Robert Barnes, Washington Post Supreme Court reporter. There have been a couple of cases regarding the Voting Rights Act in the past few years where there have been rulings that resulted in major changes. Is that a possibility here?
Well, yeah, that was certainly something that the liberal justices were quite open about, saying they feared. Justice Kagan specifically brought up the fact that the court had cut back on Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act once before, that it, in just a couple of terms ago, limited the Voting Rights Act protection of voting practices that could harm or dilute minority voters. And she said that Alabama's challenge was basically the same kind of challenge and the same kind of threat. She said, what's going to be left of the Voting Rights Act if we go along with you?
A final question. The oral argument today in this first case ran almost 2 hours. And we've seen that in the last term. I remember when oral arguments for Supreme Court cases were an hour. Is it now changing?
Right. It has changed. I mean, it's supposed to be an hour, but they rarely are anymore. The justices give each other a turn more to ask questions. Chief Justice Roberts is much more lenient about it going on. Today's case was a little unusual. It was 2 cases combined, so there were 4 lawyers making arguments at the court, and those always go a little longer. But it's certainly true that the oral arguments have grown longer and longer over the past couple of years.
Robert Barnes, Washington Post Supreme Court reporter. Find his stories at WashingtonPost.com, and on Twitter he's at SCOTUS Reporter. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And now some of today's Supreme Court oral argument in that case, Merrell v. Milligan, about the Voting Rights Act and to what extent race should be taken into account when drawing congressional district boundaries. Here is Justice Elena Kagan questioning Alabama Solicitor General Edmund LaCour.
This is an important statute. It's one of the great achievements of American democracy to achieve equal political opportunities regardless of race, to ensure that African Americans could have as much political power as white Americans could. That's a pretty big deal, and it was strengthened, this statute, in 1982 when this court interpreted it too narrowly for Congress's taste, and Congress said, no, we didn't mean that at all, and made this into a results test. Now, in recent years, this statute has fared not well in this court. Shelby County looks at Section 5, and it says, no, Section 5, we don't need that anymore. And one of the things it says is we have Section 2. And then Brnovich comes along, and that's a Section 2 case, and the court says, you know what, Section 2, they're really dilution claims. This is a denial claim, and so we can construe that very narrowly. But of course, there's just all these cases that are dilution claims. That's really what Section 2 is about. And now here we are, Section 2 is a dilution claim. This, the classic Section 2 dilution claim. And you're asking us essentially to cut back substantially on our 40 years of precedent and to make this too extremely difficult to prevail on. So what's left?
Justice Kagan, the Voting Rights Act has achieved tremendous gains. In 2016, for example, Alabama, black voters turned out at 4.6 points higher than white voters, even though nationwide that gap was 2.3% the other direction. In 2018, much the same story. We had the second highest black registration in the country, second only to Mississippi. So I think we need to not lose sight of that. In terms of what Section 2 is supposed to be doing, I think the problem here is we're kind of in like a third generation of vote dilution claims. You have the multi-member districts is Generation 1. Generation 2 was getting rid of the racial gerrymanders. But Generation 3 is let's impose the racial gerrymanders, which I don't think Section 2 was ever designed to do. It's what's led to all this confusion, this tension between an equal openness statute and an equal protection mandate. And we're just saying, like, that cannot be what it means. Whatever it means, it can't be that we have to obliterate longstanding, unprecedented, undisputed communities of interest in favor of districts that arch across the state to connect people from Mobile and Dothan, which no neutral map drawer would ever do. And obviously was not the concerns of the 1982 Congress.
Alabama Solicitor General Edmund LaCour, questioned by Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan during today's oral argument in the case Merrell v. Milligan. Arguing on behalf of the federal government, U.S. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogger. Here's a question from Justice Samuel Alito.
if a computer simulation can produce this second majority-minority district only by insisting that that district be created, subordinating all the other districting factors to race, isn't that predominance?
Well, the way that this court has described the predominant standard is that the state has basically subjugated all other traditional districting criteria. It's often revealed by the fact that the district is bizarre by any measure and is irregularly shaped, although that's not an absolute requirement. But I think that the first jingles precondition already guards against that because, of course, to satisfy step one of the framework, the plaintiff has to come in with a reasonably configured district at the outset.
Elizabeth Prelogger, the U.S. Solicitor General, questioned by Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. The newest justice on the court is Katanji Brown Jackson, and as mentioned in the interview we did a few moments ago, she's been an active questioner. Here's a question today to another lawyer arguing the case, Abna Connor, attorney for Marcus Castor and the respondents.
If you have a million maps and you can generate a million maps, why shouldn't we require that one map be drawn in a race-neutral way? And I actually think the question is, why should we require at jingle step one that a map be drawn in a race-neutral way? And there are two possibilities, right? One possibility is because that's what Congress would have wanted. But when I read Section 2, I don't see that Congress is requiring race neutrality. In fact, the language beyond equally open is equally open by participation of members in a particular class of citizens, in that its members have less opportunity than other members. So it seems as though Congress is authorizing the consideration of race. And then the second question is, all right, why should we do this? Because the Constitution requires some sort of race neutrality, and based on my colloquy with your friend on the other side, I think that the Constitution doesn't require it. So do I have the question right, why should we require this? Or does Justice Barrett have the question right, why shouldn't we?
I think all of the questions are correct. Fundamentally, there's no basis for injecting this new simulation standard or race-neutral standard into Jingles 1. It was not the purpose of the Section 2 standard as created by Congress. It is not at all required under the Constitution. It would be a brand new principle that really doesn't serve any end. And the end result gets us to the exact same place that we have right now, which is it possible to show up in court with a district that meets these criteria? And and here, where we talk about what does the usual map drawer in Alabama draw? What is considered a sprawling district in Alabama? The best place to look is to the very guidelines that my friend on the other side specifically mentioned. And those guidelines take into account contiguity, compactness, political subdivision boundaries, precincts, all of these things that our maps performed as good or better, and they also take into account race. And they say that you complying with the Voting Rights Act shall come before anything else, and specifically including core preservations and communities of interest.
Attorney Abba Connor and Supreme Court Justice Katanji Brown Jackson at today's oral argument. You can find the full oral argument, runs about 2 hours, at our video library, cspan.org. And a reminder, the Supreme Court allowing audio of the arguments live, so no actual video, just audio. Speaking of the Supreme Court, this from the Washington Post. Former President Donald Trump's lawyers asked the Supreme Court on Tuesday to intervene in the Mar-a-Lago document seizure case, saying the special master appointed in the matter should be allowed to review the classified papers. The filing came after a unanimous 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit granted the Justice Department's request to keep about 100 classified documents separate from a review of documents being conducted by a court-appointed legal expert called a special master. The department has launched a high-stakes investigation to determine if the former president or his advisors mishandled national security secrets or hid or destroyed government records. They're reporting from the Washington Post. Economic equity was a theme today at the Treasury Department's annual Freedmen's Bank Conference. Keynote speech by the Vice President Kamala Harris. The Treasury Department explains that the original Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company was established in 1865 to provide newly emancipated Black Americans with the financial mechanisms to safeguard their earnings, build financial security, and generate family wealth. Here's the Vice President.
And from my travels, I will share with you, there are so many people in our country that have incredible dreams. fueled by their ambition, fueled by their aspiration, fueled by seeing what is possible and then going for it. But far too many still lack the resources and the support to make those dreams a reality. And what ends up happening then is these entrepreneurs cannot access capital to start a business. We're talking about families who then cannot access the capital they need to buy a home, students who cannot access capital to get an education because they live in an underserved community and because often they also do not have the benefit of intergenerational wealth. We need to address this because, again, there is a complete disconnect between their inability to grow and the fact that they are so talented and desirous of doing just that. So let's deal with that disconnect, which we also refer to as disparities, because we see that people in our country are having an experience that is not equal. And that's why we talk about equity, because we recognize not everybody starts out on the same base. They don't start out in the same place, even though they have the same God-given capacity. So when we talk about the work we are doing here together, it is recognizing that and being guided by this principle of what we must do in the spirit and in the interest of equity. And to do this, one of the aspects of the success we have seen so far is the benefit and the incredible power of public-private partnership. The public and the private sector joining together. And what we have been doing and must do more is to combine the expertise and the experience of the private sector with the reach and the scale that only the government can provide.
Vice President Kamala Harris at the Treasury Department today holding its now annual Freedmen's Bank Conference. It's been going on since 2015. Vice President remarks about equity in another context, recovery and rebuilding of Hurricane Ian's destruction in Florida, came up today in an interview with Congressman Greg Steube, Republican from Florida, on Fox Business Channel. This comes as the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, which hit Florida last week as a Category 4. Rescue crews still going door to door in search of survivors. The death toll now over 100. Some island communities in Florida cut off from the mainland. Hundreds of thousands of people still without electricity. And a lot of Floridians are now homeless. Here's Congressman Greg Steube.
I'm leading a letter of the delegation, the Florida delegation, to ask specifically for a supplemental appropriations of disaster relief specifically to Florida. And I'm asking the Democrats to not fill this full of pork and Green New Deal and Ukraine funding and all these other things. We need to focus on what Florida needs. We're absolutely going to need a federal disaster supplemental. I think the number that Byron threw out there, I think that's going to be 1% of the damage overall that we've seen. Parts of his district, like Sanibel Island, are completely destroyed. Parts of my district are going to have to be rebuilt. We have a very tough property insurance market here in Florida as it is. We had, leading up to this storm, several property insurance providers, fail or cancel or leave the state. So that's going to be a huge problem. And as those insurance policies either get canceled or they're not being fulfilled, that's going to rely upon FEMA. And FEMA is going to have to pick up that slack, which is why we need a disaster supplemental. I've already spoke to Leader McCarthy. I'm leading a letter for the delegation asking the Democrats, who obviously are in control of the House right now, to do a clean supplemental when we go back to Washington.
Well, look, I'm told that when the government funding runs out December 16th, the Democrats are going to come up with more spending in the NDAA or more spending to try to jam in as much green spending as they can. Meanwhile, you've got Kamala Harris the other day saying that any aid coming from the federal level is going to be based on equity, based on race. I mean, it was absolutely horrifying comments. The White House knows it was horrifying because they're trying to explain it away, saying she was talking about long-term investment. She was very clear, saying the aid is going to be based on equity.
That's a completely racist statement by her. I hope that's really not their intent, and I hope that they're going to get the aid out to the people that need it, regardless of race. Race should not be a factor here. Everybody that lived in Arcadia was affected the same. Everybody that lived in Port Charlotte was affected the same. And the funding should not be based on anything other than need. And right now, Americans and Floridians have a desperate need to get resources to get back on their feet.
Congressman Greg Steube, Republican from Florida, interviewed by the Fox Business Channel host Maria Bartiromo. You heard Congressman Steube refer to Byron. That's Byron Donalds, another Republican congressman from Florida. U.S. House not expected back in session until after Election Day in November. The Senate is planning to come back this month to work on, but not vote on, the Annual Defense Programs Authorization Bill known as the NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden will be traveling to Florida on Wednesday to survey the hurricane damage and talk about recovery. Here's the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with what to expect.
Tomorrow, President Biden and the First Lady will travel to Fort Myers, Florida, to reaffirm his commitment to supporting the people of Florida as they recover and rebuild from the devastating storm. While there, the president will meet with small business owners and local residents impacted by Hurricane Ian and thank the federal, state, and local officials working around the clock to provide life-saving assistance, restore power, distribute food and water, removing debris, and begin rebuilding efforts. Governor DeSantis, the FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell, and other state and local officials will also provide the president with an operational briefing on the current response and recovery efforts.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters in the White House briefing room. She was later asked whether when the president met with Governor Ron DeSantis, would they discuss anything else but hurricane recovery? She said no, now is not the time for that. On Wall Street, the Dow up 825 points. Dow rose 1,500 points, more than 1,500 in 2 days. Nasdaq up 360 today. S&P up 112. Trading in stock shares of Twitter was stopped briefly today after the price jumped on reports that billionaire Elon Musk was going forward with his $44 billion deal to buy the company after the issue had been tied up in court. In fact, there was a trial scheduled in 2 weeks. Later in the day, it was confirmed that Elon Musk did send a letter to Twitter filing this with the Securities and Exchange Commission to buy Twitter at the originally agreed upon price of $44 billion. Twitter resumed trading and ended the day up 22%. Labor Department says that the number of U.S. job openings fell from 11.2 million in July to 10.1 million in August. But the number of workers laid off from their jobs in August was higher than July, 1.6 million versus 1.5 million. A new survey of CEOs around the world by KPMG finding 86% expect a recession next year, though most say it'll be short and mild. The Federal Aviation Administration announcing today an increase in the minimum rest time that airlines must give flight attendants between shifts that are 14 hours or less, upping that rest time from 9 hours to 10 hours. The FAA Acting Administrator Bill Nolan holding a news conference this morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport.
Earlier this morning, I signed the paperwork, and the ink may be drying still, that increases rest period for flight attendants to 10 consecutive hours, no exception. Sarah. It's been a long road, and it's about time. I can tell you it's been a priority for me and for this administration, and that's why we are here today. I'm a pilot. And as any pilot can tell you, we cannot fly the plane without the safety expertise and support of flight attendants. Flight attendants are trained to take action during emergencies, administer first aid, conduct evacuations, manage medical emergency. They know the location of every piece of equipment needed during an emergency. Fire extinguishers, first aid kits, flotation devices, oxygen masks, and emergency slides. They also check the equipment before flight. I spent many years as a line captain and on both the MD-80 and the Boeing 757 and 767. I remember on one particular flight that I had a hydraulic issue. I briefed the flight attendants and we let the passengers know that we were returning to Dallas due to a mechanical issue. As always, the flight attendants did an incredible job of making sure the passengers were informed, but also making sure that they were safe and felt confident as we returned to the airport. During those years of flying the line, I remember many times being at maximum duty with minimal layover time. And flight attendants had even fewer rest hours than pilots. I worked alongside them, traveled with them, and I can tell you firsthand that well-rested crew members are important to safety. And as we've seen too often recently, they are in the front lines, or they are on the front lines, responding to unruly passengers who could threaten the safety of flight and other passengers. Like I said, they need just as much rest, because flight attendants are the foundation of aviation safety's culture, starting with cabin safety.
FAA Acting Administrator Bill Nolan at Reagan-Washington National Airport. Joining him, Sarah Nelson, the International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, who pointed out that studies required by Congress showed that lack of rest caused an increased risk in flight attendants of cancer and heart and respiratory problems. Congress passed this increase in minimum rest time rule in 2018, but it was never implemented by the Trump administration. As soon as it's published, it goes into effect 30 days after. Washington Today continues in a moment.
There are a lot of places to get political information, but only at C-SPAN do you get it straight from the source. No matter where you are from or where you stand on the issues, C-SPAN is America's network. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. If it happens here, or here, or here, or anywhere that matters, America is watching on C-SPAN, powered by cable.
And welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app. Today marks 100 days since the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Jackson, which overturned the previous Roe v. Wade decision that had guaranteed a constitutional right to abortion. President Biden today meeting with his task force on reproductive health care access at the White House, focusing on laws passed in a dozen Republican-led states that have limited or outlawed abortion since the Supreme Court acted. President today also announcing new guidelines for universities from the Education Department to protect students from discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, and new grants to protect access to reproductive health care services, that from the Health and Human Services Department. Here's President Biden.
I've said before, the court got Roe right nearly 50 years ago. And Congress should codify the protections of Roe and do it once and for all. But right now, we're short a handful of votes. So the only way it's going to happen is if the American people make it happen. And meanwhile, congressional Republicans are doubling down on the extreme position with the proposal for a national ban. Let me be clear what that means. It means that even if you live in a state where extremist Republican officials aren't running the show, your right to choose will still be at risk, because Republicans in Congress want to pass a law to take away the right to choose for every woman in every state, in every county. And there's no pushing back from that. It's also pushing laws to not allow for exceptions of rape and incest, and or the life of the mother in some cases. And it's a really scary part that in some states they're already succeeding. When the Dobbs decision came down, I said, and Justice Thomas warned us very plainly, that this wouldn't stop with a woman's right to choose. And it would extend to the right to privacy itself and things like contraception. And so it was no surprise that we're seeing extremist laws pop up around the country that are having a ripple effect far beyond the health rights of a pregnant woman. We have doctors here with us today who are on the front lines of this crisis, and many of these laws would make doctors criminals just for treating a patient.
President Joe Biden at the White House, a meeting of his task force on reproductive health care access. This article at CNN, not many Republican candidates want to talk about abortion in their campaigns, especially in their costly paid television or digital ads. But the few who are taking on the issue are doing so with a familiar message. We aren't the extremists, Democrats are. It's a theme playing out across the country from gubernatorial contests to House and Senate races. While most GOP attack ads focus on issues like the economy, the border, and crime, some Republicans have looked to counter Democratic messaging on abortion rights. That from CNN. One of those candidates is Zach Nunn. He is running against Democratic Congresswoman Cindy Axne in Iowa's 3rd Congressional District.
Most Iowans support common sense limits on abortion. Cindy Axne votes for the most extreme abortion laws in the world, allowing abortion up until the moment of birth, and voted against providing life-saving medical care for a baby who survives an abortion. Look, good people can disagree on abortion, but Cindy Axne is too extreme. Here's where I stand. I'm pro-life. I voted for exceptions for health of the mother, to expand access to contraceptives and streamline adoptive services. I'm Zach Nunn, and I approve this message.
An ad in Iowa's 3rd Congressional District race. Some other Republican candidates who are running ads on the abortion issue this year. Adam Laxalt, nominee for Senate in Nevada, facing incumbent Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto. And in Washington State, the Republican candidate for Senate, Tiffany Smiley, facing Democratic incumbent Patty Murray. This is Washington today. Now to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This from Associated Press, Dateline Lehman. Ukraine, Russian troops abandoned a key Ukrainian city so rapidly that they left the bodies of their comrades in the streets, offering more evidence Tuesday of Moscow's latest military defeat as it struggles to hang on to 4 regions of Ukraine that it illegally annexed last week. Meanwhile, Russia's upper house of parliament rubber-stamped the annexations following referendums that Ukraine and its Western allies have dismissed as fraudulent. And in Washington, the U.S. government announced Tuesday it would give Ukraine an additional $625 million in military aid. That from AP. First to the vote in the Russian Federation Council, that's the upper house of the legislature. The chair is Valentina Matviyenko.
I believe all of you realize the extent of responsibility imposed on the senators. I'm sure that today we will make a fateful, long-awaited, and only the right decision. I invite you to vote on ratification of the treaty between the Russian Federation and the Donetsk People's Republic. The decision has been made unanimously. Colleagues, I invite you to vote on ratification of the treaty between the Russian Federation and the Luhansk People's Republic. The decision has been made, also unanimously. I invite you to vote on the ratification of the treaty between the Russian Federation and the Zaporizhia region. The decision has been made unanimously. I invite you to vote on ratification of the treaty between the Russian Federation and the Kherson region, on the Kherson region joining the Russian Federation. The decision has been made unanimously.
A portion of the session of the Russian Federation Council, their upper legislative house, today voting to annex parts of Ukraine. That video from Reuters. Russia's lower house approved the annexation on Monday. Last step is the okay from the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, who put the whole thing in motion last week. But that's on paper. On the ground, the Ukrainian forces are pressing their counteroffensive against the Russian military. And at the Pentagon, Laura Cooper, Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, announcing a new U.S. military aid package for Ukraine.
Today, I'm proud to announce a new security assistance package to provide Ukraine with more weapons, ammunition, and equipment that its forces are using so effectively on the battlefield. This authorization of a presidential drawdown of security assistance, valued at up to $625 million, will contribute to meeting Ukraine's critical defense needs. it is the Biden administration's 22nd drawdown of equipment from DoD inventories for Ukraine since August of 2021. It is also the first presidential drawdown for Ukraine in the new fiscal year. I want to thank Congress for its support for the continuing resolution, which enables the administration to continue providing timely assistance to Ukraine. The capabilities in this package are tailored to meet Ukraine's immediate needs, the highlights of which include 4 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or as you know them, HIMARS, and associated ammunition. Secondly, 16 M777 155mm howitzers, along with 75,000 155mm artillery rounds, and 500 precision-guided 155mm artillery rounds. Third, 1,000 155mm rounds of remote anti-armor mine, or RAM, systems. 16 M119 105mm howitzers, 30,000 120mm mortar rounds, and then the last item I want to touch on is 200 Max Pro mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, which provide Ukraine with a resilient capability for transporting troops in heavily mined terrain. This package will provide the Ukrainian Armed Forces with additional capabilities and munitions that it needs to maintain momentum in the east and in the south, including additional artillery and precision fires.
Laura Cooper is Deputy Assistant of Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at a Pentagon news conference today. More from the Associated Press article. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has formally ruled out talks with Russia, declaring that negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin are impossible after his decision to annex regions of Ukraine. The Kremlin replied by saying that it will wait for Ukraine to agree to sit down for talks, noting that may not happen until a new Ukrainian president takes office. The former Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, says that he's been asked by Ukraine to explain to U.S. lawmakers and government officials the text of a proposal titled The Kyiv Security Compact International Security Guarantees for Ukraine Recommendations. It sets out some binding agreement between Ukraine and other countries, proposals for that, including the United States, to guarantee Ukraine's security. Anders Fogh Rasmussen explaining today at a program hosted by the Atlantic Council.
So you've been briefing this new compact, and you've had it out for about 3 weeks. Have you begun talking to the U.S. government, to your government, to the EU, and how has the reception been?
Yeah. President Zelensky asked me to do what I could to promote the security compact in important capitals of potential guarantor states. So I decided to start in Washington because we all know that without an active support of the United States, this security compact will never ever materialize. And I will go to other capitals as well. I have had meetings in Washington with the administration and with members of Congress. And overall, I have only met a positive attitude. There may be details to discuss, but in fact, this is a codification of what is already going on. So the essence of the Security Compact is to make Ukraine capable to defend itself against any Russian attack. And to that end, you need a very strong Ukrainian military. You need enhanced cooperation on intelligence between Ukraine and its partners. You need joint exercises and training of Ukrainian forces, and we also need to build a strong Ukrainian defense sector. So this is the commitment that potential guarantor states will issue. So the idea is that a group of international guarantors, the US, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Turkey, Poland, just to mention some of the countries, that they commit themselves to help Ukraine build the capacity to defend itself by itself.
Anders Fogh Rasmussen was NATO Secretary General from 2009 through 2014. Before that, he was the Prime Minister of Denmark. Today, at a program on Russia's invasion of Ukraine hosted by the Atlantic Council. We covered it all, and you can find the full video at cspan.org, or video library. Following North Korea's launch Monday night of a ballistic missile that flew over Japan, first time that North Korea has done that in 5 years, a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, Adrienne Watson, putting out a statement calling that launch dangerous and reckless and destabilizing, and writing, the U.S. will continue its efforts to limit the DPRK's ability to advance its prohibited ballistic missile and weapons of mass destruction programs, including with allies and UN partners. More today on this incident at the State Department briefing with the principal deputy spokesperson, Vedant Patel.
We condemn this dangerous and reckless launch of a long-range ballistic missile that flew over Japan, and it posed an unacceptable threat to the Japanese public. This action is a clear violation of multiple resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council, and it again demonstrates the threat that the DPRK holds, both as it relates to its unlawful weapons of mass destruction program, but also its ballistic missiles program, and the threat that it poses to its neighbors as well. Together with the international community, we call on the DPRK to refrain from further provocations and to engage in sustained and substantive dialogue. We continue to consult closely with our allies, as is evidenced by the number of high-level communications that have happened from across the interagency with their counterparts. And I'd also reiterate that our commitments to Japan and the Republic of Korea are ironclad.
Right, but is there any, are there any thoughts about where you take it from here beyond the consultations? I mean, what do the consultations lead to? What are you consulting about? Presumably, it's a response.
I don't have any specific actions to preview or read out for you at this time, but again, we condemn this dangerous and reckless launch, and again, are holding close consultations and continue to communicate directly with our allies and partners on this issue, especially with the Republic of Korea and Japan.
State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel. CNN reports that this marks North Korea's 23rd missile launch this year, including the most ballistic missiles filed in a single year since leader Kim Jong-un took power in 2012. The story from Axios: the White House issued a call for artificial intelligence systems to be developed with built-in protections Tuesday, even as the tech industry barrels toward an AI free-for-all. Automated systems can influence or even determine important aspects of American lives, including healthcare, employment, housing, and education. And the U.S. government regulations covering the new technology remain minimal or non-existent. Alondra Nelson is the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy.
After a year of deep engagement with the American people, we are releasing the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Much more than a set of principles, this is a blueprint to empower the American people to expect better and demand better from their technologies. The blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights is a call to make these 5 core protections a reality. First, the systems you use should work. They should be safe and effective. Second, you should be protected from algorithmic discrimination, and automated systems should be used and designed in an equitable way. Third, you should be protected from abusive data practices via built-in protections, and you should have agency over how data about you is used. Fourth, you should know when an automated system is being used and understand how and why it contributes to outcomes that impact you. And fifth, you should be able to opt out and have access to a human being that can quickly help you solve the problem.
Alondra Nelson is Deputy Director, White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, today at the White House on the release of this AI Bill of Rights. More from the article at Axios. What's next, they write? The White House says it will lead by example, with a dozen federal agencies announcing actions related to automated systems, including development of a new federal policy for the procurement and use of AI systems. Country singer Loretta Lynn, best known for her song Coal Miner's Daughter, has died at the age of 90. Her family says that she died peacefully in her sleep at her home, a ranch in Hurricane Mills, Tennessee. In 2013, Loretta Lynn was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by then-President Barack Obama.
Loretta Lynn was 19 the first time she won big at the local fair. Her canned vegetables brought home 17 blue ribbons and made her Canner of the Year. Where is that? Now that's impressive. For a girl from Butcher Holler, Kentucky, that was fame. Fortunately for all of us, she decided to try her hand at things other than canning. Her first guitar cost $17, and with it, this coal miner's daughter gave voice to a generation, singing what no one wanted to talk about and saying what no one wanted to think about. And now, over 50 years after she cut her first record and canned her first vegetables, Loretta Lynn still reigns as the rule-breaking, record-setting queen of country music.
President Barack Obama in 2013 at the White House presenting Loretta Lynn with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That from C-SPAN's video library. Loretta Lynn has died at the age of 90. The U.S. Capitol Historical Society tweeting, "Rest in peace, Loretta Lynn. Her song Coal Miner's Daughter is in the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry and depicts life with her father, who died of black lung disease in 1959. 10 years later, Congress passed the Coal Act to better protect workers from accidents and disease." Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter to get Washington's top stories sent to your inbox every day. You can subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.